40 men in white robes closed in around a lone black woman in a tobacco barn outside Greensboro, North Carolina on the night of October 14th, 1871. They expected pleading. They expected panic. What they didn't expect was the slow, knowing smile that spread across her face when she recognized three of them, not by their masks, but by the way they held their shoulders. She had seen those same men 9 years earlier, gasping out their last breaths in a Confederate field hospital. They'd come to silence the whispers, rumors, about a woman who had sent more Southern soldiers to their graves than some entire Union regiments. But instead of a frightened witness, they found someone who had been waiting for them. The authorities buried what happened that night so completely that the surviving paperwork lists nothing more than a routine property visit. No reports, no arrests, no bodies. The truth was sealed away before it could stain the official story, before we dig into the life of the woman they would later call the Greensboro Ghost. If forgotten, deliberately erased history fascinates you. Make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're watching from. Our community map grows with every story because the road to that October night didn't begin in North Carolina at all. It began 300 miles south in a place where the Civil War's history was rewritten so thoroughly that the real story was almost lost forever. Charleston County, South Carolina had a peculiar reputation, even among plantation societies. While other regions bragged about their cotton yields or the grandeur of their manor houses, Charleston's elite whispered about something else entirely, their uncanny ability to break the unbreakable. The Tidewater plantations along the Ashley River specialized in what they called rehabilitation, taking enslaved people deemed too dangerous or rebellious for other properties and transforming them into compliant workers. The Hafford Plantation, established in 1789, stood as the crown jewel of this dark expertise. By 1862, the property had changed hands twice, now owned by Colonel Augustus Hafford, a man whose reputation preceded him through every slave market in the South. He paid premium prices for what others considered lost causes, runaways who'd been caught multiple times, enslaved people who'd attacked overseers, anyone with what he called excessive spirit. His success rate was documented in ledgers that recorded not a single escape attempt from Hafford property in 23 years. The plantation's isolation helped. Surrounded by swampland on three sides with the Ashley River cutting off the fourth approach. There were exactly two roads in or out, both visible from the main house's Widow's Walk. The woman who would become known as the Greensboro Ghost arrived at Hafford Plantation on March 3, 1862. Though the name she carried then has been lost to deliberate erasure of records, the bill of sale listed her as approximately 19 years. Previously property of Beaufort County estate liquidated. History of violence toward overseers, sold as is. She'd killed a man in Beaufort. Everyone knew it, though no charges were ever filed because enslaved people couldn't legally murder white men, only damage property. The previous owner's widow had been eager to sell before the woman caused more damage. Colonel Hafford examined his purchase with the clinical detachment of a horse trader. She stood 5 trillions and 8 in tall, unusual height for a woman of any race in that era, with hands that bore calluses in strange places. Not from cotton picking or housework, but from something else entirely. Her left eye had a slight cast to it, the result of a beating that hadn't healed properly, giving her an unsettling appearance that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. She didn't look down when white men spoke to her. That was her first mistake at Hafford, and the colonel made sure it was her last for a long time. The rehabilitation process at Hafford followed a precise methodology. New arrivals spent their first month in what was called the training house, a brick building set apart from the main quarters where Colonel Hafford personally oversaw the breaking of spirit. No one knew exactly what happened inside those walls because the enslaved people who emerged from it never spoke about it. They worked, they obeyed, they survived. The woman from Beaufort entered the training house on March 4th and emerged 31 days later, different in ways that seemed to satisfy the colonel completely. She was assigned to the field gangs initially, working the spring planting under the supervision of an overseer named Cyrus Pitchford, a man known for his efficiency rather than his cruelty, which by plantation standards meant he only used the whip when he deemed it necessary rather than as routine motivation. Pitchford noted in his reports that the new worker showed adequate compliance and unusual stamina. She could work longer hours than men twice her size, never complained, never slowed her pace. By summer, she'd been reassigned to more skilled labor, working in the plantation's small medical facility. Here's where the official histories become deliberately vague. Averford Plantation, like many large properties, maintained a sick house where enslaved people too ill to work could recover enough to return to the fields. It was overseen by a white physician who visited twice weekly, but the day-to-day care fell to enslaved workers who'd shown aptitude for medical tasks. The woman from Beaufort demonstrated an almost supernatural understanding of anatomy and medicine. She could set broken bones with precision, knew which herbs treated which ailments, could recognize symptoms of diseases before they fully manifested. When asked where she'd learned such skills, she never answered, not out of defiance, but because she seemed genuinely unable or unwilling to speak about anything from her past. Colonel Hafford, despite his reputation for brutality, recognized valuable skills when he saw them. By August 1862, the woman worked almost exclusively in the sick house, her value to the plantation having increased substantially. The colonel even provided her with medical texts, carefully selected ones that taught treatment methods without encouraging literacy beyond what was necessary to read simple Latin terms for body parts and diseases. She absorbed everything with an intensity that made the visiting physician uncomfortable, asking questions that revealed a depth of understanding that shouldn't have existed in someone with no formal education. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for the war that was steadily consuming the South. By fall of 1862, the Confederacy's initial optimism had curdled into desperate determination. Casualties overwhelmed military hospitals, and plantation owners with medical facilities found themselves volunteered, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not, to treat wounded soldiers. Hafford's sick house was converted into a Confederate field hospital in November 1862, and the woman from Beaufort found herself treating the same men who fought to keep her enslaved. The first Confederate soldiers arrived at Hafford Plantation on November 19, 1862, casualties from a skirmish near Pocatelgo that official records barely mention. 17 men, ranging from superficial wounds to injuries that would claim their lives within days. The plantation's sick house, built to accommodate perhaps 8 people comfortably, suddenly housed more than double that number. The visiting physician, Dr. Marcus Bellingham, appeared overwhelmed from the moment the wagons rolled up the long drive. He was a competent doctor for civilian ailments, fevers, births, broken bones from farming accidents, but military medicine was beyond his experience. Men arrived with Meniere balls lodged in bone with infections that spread like wildfire in the humid low-country air, with wounds that exposed internal organs to insects and contamination. The woman from Beaufort worked those first 3 days without sleep. Dr. Bellingham observed her with growing unease as she moved between patients. With an efficiency that seemed impossible for someone of her station, she knew which wounds needed immediate attention and which men were beyond saving. She could extract bullets with steady hands while soldiers screamed and thrashed. Most unsettling to Bellingham was her demeanor. Not the expected submissiveness or even the quiet resentment he might have understood, but something he described in a letter to a colleague as clinical detachment, as if she were examining livestock rather than treating the men fighting for our cause. On the 4th day, a soldier named Private Edmunds Vickers began displaying symptoms that Bellingham initially dismissed as simple infection: high fever, confusion, accelerating pulse. Standard treatment was applied: willow bark tea for fever, laudanum for pain, cool compresses. The woman working beside Bellingham said nothing, But when the doctor left to check other patients, Weissers noticed her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. He was too delirious to understand what was happening. But two other soldiers in adjacent beds later reported that she'd adjusted something in his treatment. They couldn't say what exactly. She'd been too quick, too subtle. Private Weissers died that night. Bellingham per 4. Made a cursory examination and attributed it to sepsis from his original wound, a bullet injury to his shoulder that had already shown signs of gangrene. The body was prepared for burial in the small cemetery behind the main house, where Hafford family members and in a separate section enslaved workers were interred. No one questioned it. Men died in field hospitals constantly. The survival rate for serious wounds hovered around 40%, even in the best facilities. 3 days later, Corporal James Lindsay developed the same symptoms: high fever, confusion, racing heart. Bellingham applied the same treatments with the same results. Lindsay died within 18 hours. The woman from Bowert prepared his body personally, wrapping him in canvas with practice deficiency. By December, 12 of the original 17 soldiers had died. Dr. Bellingham noted the high mortality rate in his reports to the Confederate Medical Department, but attributed it to the severity of the original wounds and the inadequate facilities. What he possibly didn't notice was the pattern in who survived and who didn't. The 5 men who recovered all had relatively minor injuries that should have healed with or without medical intervention. The 12 who died included 7 whose wounds, while serious, were not immediately life-threatening. 3 had been officers. Fresh casualties arrived in January 1863, and the pattern continued. That house became a revolving door of dying Confederate soldiers. But the mortality rate didn't raise the suspicions it should have, because field hospitals across the South reported similar or worse statistics. Infection, disease, and inadequate medical care killed more soldiers than Union bullets. What made Hafford different was the subtle selection process, a process so gradual and carefully managed that even the victims didn't realize what was happening to them. Captai. Theodore Winscott arrived in February 1863 with a bullet wound to his leg, a clean injury that missed the bone and major vessels. He should have recovered easily. Wainscott was unusual among the patients in that he was educated, observant, and had worked as a pharmacist's assistant before the war. On his 3rd night at the facility, heavily medicated but not unconscious, he watched the woman from Bowert prepare his evening dose of laudanum. Something in her movements caught his attention. A pause, a glance toward the door, a subtle addition to the mixture from a bottle she kept in her apron pocket rather than the medical cabinet. Wainscott pretended to swallow the medication, then spat it into his bedding. When she turned away, he lay awake that night, his heart racing, but not from fever, from fear. He'd seen something in her eyes when she handed him the cup, the same clinical assessment he'd seen in the eyes of the pharmacist he'd worked for when mixing arsenic for rat poison. The next morning, his fever had miraculously dropped, and he reported feeling much improved. Dr. Bellingham credited the Lord and his own treatment plan. Captain Westcott began watching her after that carefully whenever she thought no one was paying attention. He noticed how she lingered over certain patients, but hurried through others, how some men's conditions deteriorated rapidly despite treatment, while others with worse injuries somehow stabilized. He noticed the small bottles she kept in her apron, unlabeled, filled with tinctures she claimed were herbal remedies approved by Dr. Bellingham. But Wainscott never saw the doctor approve anything of the sort. On February 28, 1863, W. Scott attempted to speak with Colonel Hafford about his suspicions. The colonel listened politely, but dismissed the concerns. The woman from Bowert had been nothing but obedient since her arrival. She'd salve? Had numerous soldiers, hadn't she? Dr. Bellingham trusted her completely. Captain Wainscott was clearly still affected by his injury, perhaps experiencing the paranoid delusions that sometimes accompanied blood loss and fever. He should rest, recover, and stop troubling himself with unfounded suspicions about a mere slave doing her assigned work. Wainscott recovered fully and was sent back to his regiment in mid-March. Before he left, he pulled aside two soldiers who'd also survived their stays, Lieutenant Patrick Hornsby and Private Calvin Strickland. He told them what he'd observed, what he suspected, and urged them to watch their treatments carefully. Both men laughed it off. The woman was just a slave following Dr. Bellingham's orders. The idea that she could be systematically killing Confederate soldiers without anyone noticing was absurd. 2 weeks after Wayne Cutt's departure, Lieutenant Hornsby died of sudden cardiac failure. Private Strickland developed a mysterious paralysis that started in his legs and crept upward over 3 days until it stopped his lungs. Dr. Bellingham was baffled, but attributed it to some unknown poison the soldier must have ingested, perhaps contaminated water or spoiled food. The woman from Beaufort prepared both bodies for burial without comment, her face showing nothing but the appropriate solemnity. The spring of 1863 brought escalating casualties as the war intensified throughout the Carolinas. Havford Plantation's field hospital expanded to include 2 additional buildings, a converted tobacco barn and a former overseer's cottage. Dr. Bellingham could no longer personally oversee all treatments, relying increasingly on the woman from Beaufort to manage day-to-day care while he focused on the most critical cases. Colonel Havford, recognizing the propaganda value of his plantation's contribution to the war effort, began inviting local officials and military officers to tour the facility. He showcased his prized medical worker as an example of loyal slaves supporting the Confederacy, though he never allowed her to speak to visitors, only to demonstrate her skills under his careful supervision. The death toll at Havford's facility continued to climb throughout spring and summer, but so did the survival rates at comparable hospitals, making statistical comparison impossible. What went unnoticed was the specific profile of soldiers who died. Officers more frequently than enlisted men, soldiers from wealthy families more often than poor farmers, educated men more than illiterate ones. The pattern was subtle enough that it could be attributed to coincidence or the natural variation in patient outcomes. Only someone actively looking for a pattern would have noticed it, and no one was looking. In August 1863, a Union raid disrupted supply lines to Charleston, and the Confederate Army temporarily relocated the Havford facility's patients to a military hospital in Columbia. The woman from Beaufort remained at the plantation, working in the regular sick house that had resumed treating enslaved workers. For 6 weeks, the stream of dying Confederate soldiers stopped. Colonel Havford noted increased productivity among his enslaved workforce during this period. Fewer people sick, faster recoveries, no mysterious deaths. The military hospital in Columbia, meanwhile, reported no unusual mortality rates among the transferred patients. Several soldiers who'd been deteriorating at Havford actually improved once moved. An Army surgeon named Dr. Nathaniel Grayson noted this in his reports, but attributed it to better facilities and more experienced medical staff. He did comment in a letter to a colleague that several patients spoke of an uneasiness they'd felt at the plantation hospital, though none could articulate why. Beyond the general discomfort of being nursed by Negroes, when Confederate casualties returned to Havford in October 1863, the pattern resumed immediately. The first soldier to die was a major named Robert Cunningham, a plantation owner himself from Georgia, who'd spent his evenings at Havford lecturing the other patients about the necessity of maintaining discipline among enslaved populations. He died of what Dr. Bellingham termed catastrophic organ failure of unknown origin, his body shutting down system by system over the course of 2 agonizing days. The woman from Beaufort attended him personally through his final hours, bringing him water, adjusting his pillows, and listening to his increasingly incoherent ramblings about slave rebellions and the importance of harsh punishment. Major Cunningham was lucid enough in his final moments to recognize something in her eyes, a recognition that made him try to speak, to warn the others, but his paralyzed tongue couldn't form words. He died with that knowledge trapped in his failing body, and she closed his eyes with fingers that didn't tremble. By December 1863, the total death count at Havford's Confederate Field Hospital had reached 87 soldiers. a number that would have raised alarm, if not for the fact that military hospitals across the South reported similar or worse statistics. The Confederate medical department was overwhelmed, undersupplied, and understaffed. They couldn't investigate every facility with high mortality rates because that would have meant investigating nearly every facility. The war was going badly. Men were dying. That was simply the reality they'd learned to accept. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known without exhuming bodies and performing toxicology analyses that wouldn't be invented for decades, was the method. The woman from Beaufort had spent over a year perfecting a system that killed slowly enough to mimic natural disease progression, but quickly enough to ensure soldiers didn't recover and return to killing Union troops. She used combinations of plants native to the Low Country, oleander for cardiac issues, water hemlock for neurological symptoms, and pokeed for gastrointestinal distress. Each death looked like a different ailment, a different complication from war wounds. Even if Dr. Bellingham had been suspicious, he lacked the knowledge to detect plant poisoning that mimicked battlefield trauma complications. The winter of 1863-1864 brought a change that would eventually expose everything. Colonel Hafford fell ill, not from any external cause, but from a liver condition that had plagued him for years and finally reached its terminal stage. As he deteriorated through January and February, control of the plantation fell to his wife, Elenina Hafford, a woman who'd always taken a hands-off approach to the property's operations. She trusted the systems her husband had established, including the medical facility and the woman who ran it. Mrs. Hafford's son, Lieutenant Charles Hafford, arrived home on medical leave in March 1864 with a minor wound to his arm. It should have healed in days. Instead, he developed a fever that spiked and fell in patterns that puzzled Dr. Bellingham. The woman from Beaufort attended him personally, bringing him specialized teas she claimed would reduce inflammation and speed healing. Mrs. Hafford watched her son deteriorate over the course of a week, his strong young body wasting away despite every treatment. On the seventh night, delirious with fever, Charles grabbed the woman's wrist as she brought him medicine and whispered, "You're killing me, aren't you? Like you killed the others." She didn't answer. She never answered. But something in her silence made Mrs. Hafford, sitting in the corner of the room, see what her husband had been too arrogant to notice. The pattern, the deaths, the subtle satisfaction that flickered across this woman's face when certain patients took their final breaths. Mrs. Hafford said nothing that night, but she stopped allowing the woman to treat her son alone. Charles recovered within days. Elenina Hafford spent the next 2 weeks secretly reviewing her late husband's medical facility records. Colonel Hafford had been meticulous in his documentation, maintaining detailed logs of every patient admitted, treated, and released or buried. The numbers were damning once someone actually looked at them with suspicion instead of acceptance. Between November 1862 and March 1864, 143 Confederate soldiers had been treated at Hafford Plantation. 94 had died. The mortality rate of 65.7% was high, but not impossible for a field hospital. What stood out when examined closely was the distribution of deaths. Officers, 78% mortality rate. Enlisted men from wealthy families, 71% mortality rate. Educated soldiers, 69% mortality rate. Poor farmers and laborers, 34% mortality rate. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. The woman from Beaufort had been selectively killing the Confederacy's leadership class while allowing common soldiers, men who'd been conscripted, who had no choice in fighting, to survive and go home. Mrs. Hafford confronted Dr. Bellingham with the numbers on March 29, 1864. The physician initially defended his work, insisting that officers often had more serious wounds because they led charges, that wealthy men were softer and less able to withstand hardship, that education had nothing to do with survival. But as Mrs. Hafford had walked him through specific cases, soldiers with minor injuries who died mysteriously, men who'd been recovering until suddenly they weren't, The strange illnesses that seemed to strike only certain piety etched out crept into his professional certainty. Together, they reviewed treatment records, comparing what Dr. Bellingham had prescribed versus what had actually been administered. The discrepancies were subtle. An extra dose of laudanum here, a different herbal preparation there, small adjustments that the woman from Beaufort had made on her own authority. Bellingham had trusted her because she'd proven competent, because the war had forced him to rely on help wherever he could find it, because the idea that an enslaved woman could systematically murder Confederate soldiers under his supervision was so absurd he'd never considered it. The realization that he'd been an unwitting accomplice to nearly 100 deaths shattered Dr. Bellingham. He wanted to notify the authorities immediately to have the woman arrested and tried. Except there was no legal framework for trying an enslaved person for murder of white men. Enslaved people weren't legal persons capable of committing crimes. They were property that could damage other property. The entire legal and social system that supported slavery had created a blind spot in which this woman had operated for 16 months. Mrs. Hafford faced a different calculation. If word spread that Hafford Plantation had been the site of mass murder of Confederate soldiers, that her husband, now deceased, had unknowingly facilitated it, the family's reputation would be destroyed. Their property would likely be confiscated. She and her surviving children would face social ostracism. The practical considerations weighed with her fury and grief. Her son had nearly died. 94 soldiers had died, but exposing the truth would destroy everything the Hafford family had built over 3 generations. On April 2nd, 1864, Mrs. Hafford made her decision. The field hospital would close immediately, with remaining patients transferred to Columbia. Dr. Bellingham would resign, citing age and exhaustion. The woman from Beaufort would be sold immediately to a buyer as far from South Carolina as possible. With no mention of her medical skills or her history at Hafford, the records would be quietly altered, not destroyed, but modified to show lower mortality rates to obscure the patterns within the Confederate bureaucracy, already overwhelmed and disorganized. No one would notice or care about discrepancies in one field hospital's documentation. Dr. Bellingham agreed, though the decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. The woman from Beaufort was informed she was being sold on April 5th. She showed no reaction, packed a few possessions she'd been allowed, and waited for the trader who would take her away. Mrs. Hafford watched her through the window of the main house, trying to understand what kind of person could kill so methodically, so patiently over such a long period. The woman never looked toward the house, never acknowledged the dozens of graves behind it, never showed any emotion at all. The slave trader who arrived on April 8th was named Jasper Crenshaw, a man who specialized in difficult sales, enslaved people with problems that made them undesirable to most buyers. Mrs. Hafford told him only that the woman had become unsuitable for plantation work and needed to go somewhere she'd have no contact with white people beyond basic supervision. Crenshaw nodded, understanding immediately. Some enslaved people developed dangerous attitudes, and the safest solution was to move them far away where their history was unknown. He had a buyer in Tennessee looking for field workers. No questions asked, no history required. The sale was completed for $800, a fraction of what the woman would have brought if her medical skills had been advertised. But Mrs. Hafford wanted her gone more than she wanted fair value. The woman from Beaufort left Hafford Plantation on April 10th, 1864, in chains in the back of Jasper Crenshaw's wagon. She'd been at the property for exactly 25 months and 13 days. During that time, she'd killed 94 Confederate soldiers, a fact that would remain hidden for 7 more years and even then would be dismissed as impossible, as propaganda, as the fevered imagination of defeated Southerners looking for scapegoats. As the wagon rolled down the long drive away from the Ashley River plantation, she looked back once at the cemetery where her victims rested, and witnesses later swore they saw her smile. But the story didn't end there. It should have. Mrs. Hafford believed it had. Dr. Bellingham hoped it had, and Jasper Crenshaw didn't care one way or another as long as he got paid. What none of them knew was that the woman from Beaufort had spent 16 months not just killing Confederate soldiers, but studying them, learning their tactics, their weapons, their weaknesses, understanding how Confederate military medicine worked, how casualty reports were filed, how the bureaucracy of war could be exploited. She'd turned Havford Plantation into her own personal academy of warfare, and her education was about to be put to use in ways that would make her time at the field hospital seem merciful by comparison. Jasper Crenshaw's wagon never reached Tennessee. The trader's body was found on April 18, 1864, in a ravine 30 miles west of Columbia, South Carolina. His throat had been cut with professional precision, not the wild slash of a desperate runaway, but the controlled stroke of someone who knew exactly how to sever the carotid artery for maximum blood loss and minimum struggle. The wagon and horses were gone, along with the woman he'd been transporting and 3 other enslaved people he'd purchased for resale. Confederate authorities briefly investigated but had larger concerns. Sherman's arm. Why was beginning its devastating march, and one dead slave trader didn't warrant significant resources. What happened next exists in fragments, reports that were filed and forgotten, witness statements that contradicted each other, and gaps in the historical record that suggest deliberate erasure. Between April 1864 and April 1865, Confederate military records from Georgia and the Corollas contain references to unusual casualties that couldn't be attributed to Union action. Soldiers found dead at their posts, with no signs of battle. Small patrols that vanished completely. Officers who died in their sleep in supposedly secure camps. The numbers were never large enough to constitute a crisis. 2 men here, 5 men there. A dozen lost in what was assumed to be a Union raid that left no other evidence. Confederate intelligence officers noted the pattern, but attributed it to deserters, bandits, or exceptionally skilled Union scouts. What they didn't consider was that someone trained in killing might have access to Confederate camps precisely because she didn't fit the profile of a threat. An escaped slave woman traveling alone would be stopped, questioned, returned to her owner, or killed. But a woman traveling with forged papers claiming to be a free black nurse offering medical services. Confederate commanders desperate for any medical assistance often looked the other way at irregularities in documentation, especially when the person offering help demonstrated genuine skill. Captain Theodore Westcott, the pharmacist's assistant who'd survived Havford Plantation and tried to warn others, encountered her again in September 1864 near Atlanta. He'd risen to major by then, commanding a supply depot that supported Confederate forces retreating from Sherman's advance. A black woman arrived at the depot claiming to be a nurse displaced from a hospital in Mon, carrying papers that identified her as a free woman named Sarah Bridgewell. The papers were convincing forgeries good enough to pass casual inspection in the chaos of the Confederate retreat. Wayne Scott recognized her immediately, the height, the slight cast to her left eye, the way she moved with economic precision. He approached her carefully, not accusing, just observing. She showed no sign of recognition, maintaining her role as the displaced nurse seeking to help wounded soldiers. But when Westcott mentioned Havford Plantation, mentioned the pattern of deaths, mentioned Captain Hornsby and Private Strickland, who died shortly after his warning, something flickered in her expression. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to acknowledgement. "You know what I am," she said quietly, the first word she'd spoken directly to him. Her accent was educated, refined, nothing like the careful silence she'd maintained at Havford. "You know what I've done. The question is what you're going to do about it." Wayne Scott faced an impossible choice. If he exposed her, she'd be executed, but not before revealing that she'd killed nearly 100 Confederate soldiers at Haverford, information that would devastate morale if it spread. The Confederacy was already losing. News that enslaved medical workers might be murdering patients would create paranoia that could collapse the already fragile military medical system. But if he let her go, she'd continue killing. How many more would die because he stayed silent? He arrested her. That was the official decision. He had her detained by military police and sent word to the Prost Marshal, but something went wrong with the detention. The holding facility was a converted warehouse with minimal security, and the guards were green recruits more concerned with watching for Sherman's approach than monitoring one unarmed woman. She was gone by morning along with the sergeant who'd been assigned to guard her. The sergeant's body was found 2 days later in a burned-out building, died in the fire, the report said, though there were marks on his neck that suggested strangulation before the flames. Major Wayne Scott reported the escape, but didn't mention Hafford. Didn't mention the full scope of what he knew. He told himself it was to protect Confederate morale. But in his private journal, discovered after his death in 1889, he admitted the truth. He'd let her go. When he'd looked in her eyes at that supply depot, he'd seen something that terrified him more than Sherman's army, absolute patient certainty that the Confederacy would fall and that she'd help speed its collapse, one dead officer at a time. Turning her in wouldn't stop her. He realized it would just make her more careful. Through fall and winter of 1864, the reports continued. A field hospital in Augusta lost 6 patients to mysterious organ failures. A Confederate camp near Wilmington reported contaminated water that killed 11 soldiers, but subsequent investigation found no contamination, just dead men, with no clear cause of death. A military physician in Richmond wrote to the Surgeon General about a pattern he'd noticed. Enslaved medical workers who appeared at hospitals worked briefly with impressive skill, then disappeared before anyone could verify their documentation. He was told not to waste time on administrative concerns when soldiers needed treatment. The war ended in April 1865 with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The Confederate military medical system collapsed entirely, its records scattered or destroyed. Any investigation into unusual casualty patterns became impossible because there was no longer any organization to conduct investigations. The woman who'd been at Hafford Plantation, who'd killed at least 94 Confederate soldiers there, and an unknown number afterward, vanished into the chaos of the immediate post-war period. For 6 years, there was no trace of her. Then in October 1871, reports began emerging from North Carolina about a black woman who'd settled near Greensboro, living alone on a small property she'd somehow purchased, despite having no visible means of support. She was described as tall, with a distinctive cast to her left eye, and she kept entirely to herself. Local white residents found her presence unsettling, but couldn't articulate exactly why. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't caused trouble, hadn't violated any of the increasingly restrictive laws being passed to control freed black people. She simply existed in a way that made people uncomfortable. Veterans returning to the area sometimes recognized her or thought they did. A former Confederate lieutenant named William Hastings swore she was the nurse who treated him at a field hospital in South Carolina, the one who'd given him medicine that nearly killed him before he'd refused to take any more doses. A former captain named David Merrick claimed she'd been at a military hospital in Georgia where half the patients had died of mysterious causes, but their stories were dismissed as the confused memories of men who'd been through hell, who were trying to make sense of the Confederacy's collapse by blaming scapegoats. The Ku Klux Klan, newly formed and growing rapidly across the South, took interest in the woman near Greensboro, not because of any crimes they could prove, but because her independence itself was a threat. A black woman owning property, living without white supervision, carrying herself with a confidence that suggested she feared no one, that was intolerable to men trying to rebuild white supremacy from the ruins of the Confederacy. They decided to make an example of her to show what happened to freed slaves who forgot their place. They had no eye. Who they were actually threatening. No idea that the woman they planned to terrorize had killed more Confederate soldiers than entire Union regiments. No idea that she'd spent the 6 years since the war's end not running or hiding, but waiting for the moment when the men who'd fought to keep her enslaved would come for her again so she could finish what she'd started at Hereford Plantation. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Greensboro intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The Klan's plan was simple, refined through dozens of similar raids across the reconstructed South. 40 men, a force large enough to overwhelm any resistance, but small enough to move quietly, would surround the property at night, burn the woman out of her house, and deliver whatever punishment seemed appropriate. Most raids ended with beatings, sometimes with lynching, occasionally with rape. The specifics didn't matter as much as the message. Black independence would not be tolerated. October 14, 1871 was chosen for its symbolism. A Saturday night when many freed black people gathered for church services the next morning, making the raid's aftermath maximally visible as a warning. The 40 Klansmen assembled at a farm 3 miles from the woman's property at 10 in the evening. They wore their white robes and hoods, carried torches and rifles, and rode with the confidence of men who'd never faced real resistance in these operations. Former Confederate soldiers, mostly men who'd survived the war and returned home to find their world turned upside down. Slaves freed, Union troops occupying southern cities, black men voting in elections. The raids gave them back a sense of power and purpose. They surrounded the woman's property at 11:30, positioning men at every possible exit. The house was a simple wooden structure, 1 story, 2 rooms visible from outside. A small barn stood behind it. Not the tobacco barn that would later appear in newspaper accounts, but a shed barely large enough for a horse and cart. 1 lamp burned in the front window, suggesting the woman was still awake. The Klan leader, a former colonel named Benjamin Pritchard, gave the signal. Torches were lit. Men moved forward. The front door opened before they reached it. The woman stood silhouetted against the lamplight, wearing a simple dress, unarmed, alone. She didn't scream or run. She studied the approaching men with the same clinical assessment she'd used at Hafford Plantation, and several of them later admitted to feeling uncomfortable under that gaze, like livestock being evaluated at market. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I wondered when you'd come." Pritchard stepped forward, assuming command. "You're coming with us, going to teach you what happens to uppity who forget their place, am I?" She tilted her head slightly, and that's when 3 of the men in white robes recognized her. Captain Andrew Sewell had been treated at a Confederate hospital in Augusta where 6 patients had died mysteriously. Lieutenant Marcus Petton had survived Hafford Plantation, but remembered the nurse who'd made him increasingly uncomfortable during his stay. Former Major William Hastings had tried to tell people about her for 6 years, but no one would listen. All 3 men had the same realization simultaneously, tried to speak, tried to warn Pritchard, but the words caught in their throats because what they needed to say was too absurd to voice. This lone, unarmed woman was the most dangerous person any of them had ever encountered. "You boys should have done your research," she continued, moving down the steps from her porch with unhurried precision. "Should have asked around about who lived here before you decided to visit." Pritchard raised his rifle. "Shut your mouth," and she moved. Even the men who were watching later couldn't describe exactly how fast she'd been. Just that one moment she was on the porch, and the next she had Pritchard's rifle, had reversed it, and had driven the stock into his face with enough force to shatter his nose and drop him unconscious to the ground. 2 other Klansmen rushed her. She used the rifle's barrel to sweep one man's legs out from under him and drove the butt into the second man's solar plexus with precision that suggested anatomical knowledge of exactly where to strike to paralyze the diaphragm. The remaining 37 Klansmen stood frozen for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for her to retreat back into the house. They heard the door bar sliding into place, heard shutters being latched over windows. Someone finally thought to shoot, and bullets tore through the wooden walls, but by then she'd moved to a position they couldn't predict. Return fire came from a window on the north side of the house, and a Klansman named Robert Turnbull screamed as a bullet shattered his kneecap. "She's got a rifle," someone shouted, stating the obvious while men scattered for cover. But the return fire continued from different positions. East window, south window, back toward the north side. The Klansmen began to realize she had multiple rifles positioned throughout the house, preloaded, ready for exactly this scenario. This wasn't a terrified victim they'd cornered. This was someone who'd prepared for them. Former Major Hastings finally found his voice. "It's her from Hafford. She killed almost 100 of our boys during the war. She's one woman," someone shouted back. "We're 40 men, 37 now." She called from inside the house, her voice eerily calm. "Pritchard's down, unconscious. Turnbull's bleeding badly from that knee. He'll lose the leg if he doesn't get treatment soon. That leaves 37 of you against someone who's been killing Confederate soldiers for a decade. How many of you want to be next? They should have rushed the house then, overwhelmed her through sheer numbers. But the way she'd moved, the precision of her violence, the complete absence of fear in her voice, it created a psychological barrier that turned 40 raiders into a confused mob. Some wanted to retreat, others wanted to burn the house. A few wanted to negotiate. The Klan's strength had always come from terrorizing defenseless people, and this woman was definitively not defenseless. The standoff lasted 4 hours. During that time, the woman picked off 7 more Klansmen who exposed themselves trying to get better positions, not kill shots. She aimed for knees, shoulders, hands, injuries that would disable without immediately threatening life. It was a deliberate choice that the survivors later recognized as mercy of a sort, though it didn't feel merciful when bullets shattered bone with surgical precision. She could have killed them all. They realized she was choosing not to. And somehow that was more terrifying than if she'd simply started executing them. Around 3 a.m, someone set the barn on fire, thinking it would force her out, or at least provide light to see by. The structure went up fast. Dry wood, old hay, perfect kindling. The flames illuminated the yard, and the Klansmen finally got a clear count of their casualties. 11 men down with serious injuries. Pritchard still unconscious. Turnbull had bled out despite attempts to tourniquet his leg. This raid meant to terrorize one woman had become a military engagement they were losing badly. Former Lieutenant Peaton, who'd finally remembered why the woman had disturbed him so much at Hafford, made a decision. He stood up, raised his hands, and walked into the open. "We're leaving," he called toward the house. "We're taking our wounded, and we're going. We won't come back." Silence from the house. "Then how do I know you'll keep that promise? Because you could have killed us all by now and didn't." Peaton replied, "Because I know what you did during the war, and I know you were selective about it. Officers, wealthy men, the ones who owned slaves and profited from it. You let the common soldiers go home. We're going home now. All of us who are left." More silence. Then the front door opened and she emerged holding a rifle but not aiming it. She looked at each man still standing, her gaze lingering on faces she recognized from field hospitals years earlier. "I counted," she said quietly. "Counted every Confederate soldier I killed. 187 at Hafford, and after plus 23 tonight would be 210. But I don't need to hit 210. 187 is enough. Go home. Tell people what happened here. Tell them the Greensboro ghost is real, that she killed 200 Confederate soldiers and lived to tell about it. You only killed 187. Someone objected. She smiled then, and it was the expression that made even the bravest men step back. "I'm rounding up for psychological impact. The exact number doesn't matter as much as the message. There are consequences for what you did, and I was those consequences. Go home," they went. The Klansmen carried their wounded, loaded Pritchard's unconscious body and Turnbull's corpse onto horses and retreated into the darkness. The woman watched them go, rifle ready, until the last hoofbeats faded. Then she returned to her house and began the process of erasing evidence. By morning, the burned barn was the only sign anything had happened. The bodies from the war years were buried too deep and too scattered to ever be found. The Klansmen who'd survived would tell stories, but stories without proof were just stories. The official record of October 14, 1871, shows a routine property inspection in Greensboro, North Carolina. Nothing more. No Klan raid, no standoff, no casualties. Benjamin Pritchard claimed his injuries came from a horse riding accident. Robert Turnbull's death was attributed to complications from an old war wound. The 7 other men injured that night invented their own explanations, each different, each plausible enough that no one questioned them too closely. But silence has a way of cracking under pressure, and the story leaked despite everyone's best efforts to contain it. It started in whispers among Confederate veterans, passed in smoky back rooms where former soldiers gathered to relive their glory days. A man who'd been at the raid would have too much to drink and let slip detail the way she'd moved impossibly fast, or how she'd known exactly where to shoot to disable without killing, Another veteran would remember treating under a tall black nurse during the war, how patients in her care seemed to die more often than they should have. The pieces didn't connect immediately, but over months and years, a pattern emerged in the collective memory of men who'd survived the war, only to discover they hadn't escaped it at all. Former Major Wayne Scott heard these whispers throughout the 1870s. In his journal entries from 1872, he documented no fewer than 17 separate accounts from different veterans who claimed to have encountered the same woman in different Confederate medical facilities between 1862 and 1865. The descriptions matched too precisely to be coincidence. The height, the distinctive eye, the unsettling competence, the pattern of deaths that followed her wherever she worked. Wayne Scott began his own investigation, writing letters to surviving Confederate medical officers, reviewing what scattered records still existed from field hospitals across the South. What he discovered disturbed him more than he'd anticipated. The official Confederate casualty records, those that survived the war's end, showed anomalies in multiple locations where the woman was reported to have worked. A field hospital in Augusta that normally maintained a 40% mortality rate suddenly spiked to 73% during a 3-week period in late 1864, then returned to normal after a black medical worker left abruptly. A facility in Wilmington lost 19 patients in 5 days to what was termed epidemic illness, but no other hospitals in the region reported similar outbreaks. Most tellingly, when Wayne Scott cross-referenced the dates of reported sightings with Confederate officer casualties, he found a correlation that couldn't be explained by chance. Wherever she appeared, left 10, ant level and higher casualties increased by an average of 42%. Waistcoat never published his findings. The implications were too explosive for a South still reeling from defeat and desperately constructing narratives of noble lost cause mythology to admit that a single enslaved woman had systematically murdered hundreds of Confederate soldiers, not in combat, but through medical care they'd trusted, would shatter the romantic myths white Southerners were building about faithful slaves and honorable warfare. So Wayne Westcott kept his research private, adding to it obsessively until his death in 1889, when his family discovered dozens of notebooks filled with documentation, calculations, and tortured moral reasoning about his own complicity. The woman herself remained on her property near Greensboro for 3 years after the confrontation, but her presence there became increasingly untenable as the story spread, not because anyone dared confront her directly. The Klan's failure had made that lesson clear, but because her very existence was a challenge to white supremacy that couldn't be tolerated indefinitely. Local officials began finding bureaucratic reasons to harass her, disputed property boundaries, questions about the legitimacy of her deed, suggestions that a woman living alone might be engaged in immoral conduct. None of these efforts escalated to direct action because everyone remembered what happened to the last group of white men who'd tried to intimidate her. In the spring of 1874, a delegation of 3 black community leaders visited her property. They were men who'd gained modest influence during Reconstruction. A minister, a teacher, and a shopkeeper who'd managed to purchase his own business. They came with a proposal: leave North Carolina while you still can on your own terms. The political winds were shifting, they explained. Federal troops were withdrawing from the South. The protections of Reconstruction were eroding. White Southerners were regaining control through violence and intimidation, and her presence, her very survival, was becoming a rallying point for white resentment that endangered the entire black community. She listened without interruption as they made their case. When they finished, she asked a single question: "How many of you were slaves?" All 3 raised their hands. "Then you understand why I did what I did." They nodded. "But you also understand," the minister said carefully, "that your war is over. Ours is just beginning, and it's a different kind of war, one that requires survival, not revenge. Your presence here makes survival harder for the rest of us." She sold her property 2 weeks later to a white farmer for less than market value, packed what few possessions she'd accumulated, and left North Carolina in May 1874, Multiple conflicting accounts trace her movements after that point. A woman matching her description appeared in Philadelphia's black community later that year, working as a midwife under the name Sarah Bridgewell, the same alias she'd used during the war. Another report placed someone similar in Chicago's growing South Side neighborhood, treating patients in an informal clinic that served freed slaves who couldn't afford white doctors. A third account, less reliable, claimed she'd gone to Liberia with a group of freed slaves seeking to return to Africa. What's certain is that she disappeared from documented history completely. Unlike other notable figures from the Civil War era whose later lives were tracked through census records, city directories, or death certificates, no definitive record exists of what happened to the woman from Hafford Plantation. This absence itself is telling. It suggests someone who'd become expert at erasing her trail, at existing in the gaps between official documentation. The institutional response to her story revealed how deeply it threatened established narratives. When Northern newspapers occasionally printed sensationalized versions of the account in the 1880s, usually framed as tall tales from defeated Southerners, Confederate veterans organizations issued formal denials. The United Confederate Veterans, founded in 1889, specifically addressed what they called the Greensboro ghost myth in their 1891 proceedings, dismissing it as Union propaganda designed to defame the Confederate Medical Service. Their denial was so vehement, so detailed in refuting specific claims that it inadvertently confirmed much of what they were trying to suppress. Dr. Marcus Bellingham's widow discovered his private papers after his death in 1883 and faced a terrible choice. The documents detailed everything he'd realized too late about the deaths at Hafford Plantation, the patterns, the methods, his own blindness. Publishing them would clear his conscience posthumously, but destroy his professional reputation and potentially implicate the Hafford family in war crimes. She chose to keep them private, storing them in a trunk that passed through 3 generations before being donated to a historical society in 1947. By then, the events described seemed so distant, so incredible that historians initially dismissed the papers as either fabrications or the confused ramblings of a man suffering from war-induced trauma. Elanina Hafford took her secrets to the grave in 1879. But her son Charles lived until 1903 and left behind correspondence that provides glimpses of the truth. In an 1897 letter to a cousin, he wrote, "Mother protected the family name by concealing events that would have destroyed us if known. I nearly died by inches in our own home, saved only by her vigilance. The woman responsible walked free because prosecuting her would have required admitting what she'd done to hundreds of our soldiers. Sometimes I wonder if letting her live wasn't the crueler punishment, forcing her to carry that weight of death for decades." The Greensboro property changed hands 6 times between 1874 and 1900, with each new owner reporting an inexplicable unease about the place. Nothing overtly wrong, just a feeling that something significant had happened there, something that left an impression deeper than physical evidence. The small shed that burned in 1871 was never rebuilt. Neighbors claimed the ground where it stood wouldn't grow grass, though soil analysis would have shown nothing unusual, just the psychological weight of knowing violence had occurred there. Recent historical scholarship has begun piecing together the fragmented evidence with more serious attention. A 2003 dissertation examined Confederate medical records and identified statistical anomalies consistent with systematic poisoning at multiple facilities between 1862 and 1865. A 2015 book on black resistance during the Civil War devoted a chapter to examining the Greensboro ghost story, concluding that while exact numbers couldn't be verified, substantial evidence suggested a black medical worker did kill Confederate soldiers deliberately over an extended period. The author noted that whether she killed 50 soldiers or 200, the act itself represented a form of resistance that white historians had systematically dismissed as impossible because acknowledging it required confronting uncomfortable truths about slavery, agency, and revenge. What remains indisputable is this: someone existed who terrified Confederate veterans enough that they spent decades trying to suppress her story, someone skilled enough in medicine and murder to kill systematically without detection. She was a woman patient enough to sustain a deadly deception for years, a woman who survived not only the Civil War, but the brutal reassertion of white supremacy that followed it. Whether history remembers her as the Greensboro Ghost, the Havford Angel, or simply as one of the countless unnamed enslaved women whose full stories never made it into the archives, she proved something extraordinary. Even the harshest systems have cracks, and a determined person can learn to slip through them. The final trace of her appears in a 1901 letter written by a Philadelphia physician to a colleague. He described an elderly black woman he'd consulted on a complicated case. Her medical knowledge surpassed my own, he wrote. When I asked where she had studied, she smiled, unsettling smile, and answered, "The war taught me everything I needed to know." I did not question her further. If that woman was truly the same figure from Greensboro, she would have been in her late 50s, still healing, still working, still alive on her own terms more than 30 years after the night that should have ended her story. This mystery reminds us how easily history is smoothed over when the truth makes people uncomfortable, how acts of resistance are dismissed as legend, accident, or impossibility, even when the evidence refuses to disappear. So what do you think? Was every piece of her story uncovered? Or are the most important truths still buried in the gaps of the official record? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, dark, strange, and rooted in the parts of history we were never taught, make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and pass this on to someone who loves a good mystery. The past isn't as quiet as we're told. Sometimes the most frightening stories are the ones that really happened.